So when you're talking about an event on modernizing service experiences with AI and digital, you're not wrong for thinking that a lot of the focus is going to be on chatbots and really using AI to improve digital engagement. And certainly we've covered that a lot throughout the event. We're going to continue covering that. It is a very important topic. But the simple reality is that the service experience runs far deeper than just what happens during an interaction. It has to do with the way we're running our business, the way we're determining what processes our contact center is going to have, and very importantly, it also determines how we hire and prepare the right people. No matter how AI-driven we get, we know that people are going to continue to play a pivotal role in the customer experience. And so when you're looking for ways to use AI to streamline our processes, make our contact centers more effective, and put people in position to succeed, one of those key opportunities is going to concern language testing. It's one of those areas that is so pivotal when we think about the people we're putting in front of our customers and whether they're able to best represent our brand, and yet it's one of the biggest inefficiencies we historically have. And so when you think about what AI promises, the ability to remove those inefficiencies and make our humans better, there's no better use case, no more obvious opportunity than using it to really elevate language testing, using it to make sure that the people we're hiring are the right people, that they're ready to be successful. And that's going to be even more important as we look at a new normal, one in which we're generally working remotely, where customer expectations are changing. If we're not putting the right people in those seats, we're going to run into huge problems. And we need to be able to rely on a mechanism for properly screening them and ensuring we're on the right track. And that's what today's discussion is going to be all about. Now, for today's discussion, we're going to be joined by Jacob from Immersion, which is revolutionizing the way we go about the language testing process. It enables faster screening, more accurate screening, a better understanding of who those agents are, and really allowing our time to go from the hiring process to the actual delivery process to be shrunk and therefore much more effective for our companies and for our customers. So before we dive into the discussion, I want to give Jacob the chance to share a little bit about himself, what he does, and just a little background on Immersion as a company.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. So I'm Jacob Burdis. I have had a passion for language learning for basically my whole life. I spent some time abroad in Russia. I've learned several foreign languages. And since coming back, I really wanted to see how to involve language and see how to really help the world become a smaller place by helping people better communicate with each other. And that's our mission at Immersion, is to close that global communication gap. So whether it's for educational opportunities or in this case for vocational opportunities, we at Immersion, we're really trying to provide our customers with the ability to screen more effectively for language, to do so in a fair but also scalable process. And so what we've developed is what's called the True North test. It's an automated AI-driven speaking and listening assessment. And so the purpose is to allow our customers who are obviously, as you mentioned, very concerned about language and making sure those who are representing their brand can do so effectively, can communicate effectively. We want to provide a tool to help you screen and be able to, without using and needing a human rater that comes with inherent bias, get results that are reliable that you can use quickly.
Now, before we dive into some of the more pointed questions about how your solution works, how it's helping organizations, and how those listening can kind of take a step in the right direction, I want to set some context here about why language testing is so important. On the one hand, to someone who does it probably seems extremely obvious, and certainly those who are listening who are more on the recruiting end are certainly going to get it as well. But I also want to be cognizant of the fact that a lot of people who focus on customer experience strategy, they may just kind of bucket recruiting as its own challenge and not really dive into the nuances of where recruiting can specifically go wrong or where it can be so time consuming. So to kick things off, why don't you walk us through kind of why language testing itself is kind of a big gap area, a big efficiency area when it comes to the recruiting process?
Yeah, of course. So as we all know, the way we interact as humans primarily is through language. And our ability to capture our thoughts appropriately through language really does affect how we're able to share messages back and forth. And so when you're talking about your employees who are, again, representing your brand, ensuring that they have the language skills necessary to effectively communicate really does go a long way in making sure that the quality that you're trying to deliver is strong. And so language assessment, especially in the recruiting process, is one of the most important things to make sure that you're bringing someone in who can effectively communicate and as we talked about, move forward that brand. And I will say specifically too, language, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but there's a lot of different components of language and language assessment. 30 years ago, they might have just tested grammar. How well do you understand grammar and vocabulary? But as we know now, someone can have a really good understanding of vocabulary and grammar and still struggle communicating or effectively understanding. And so it's really important too, when you're choosing to use language assessment in the screening process, that you're actually screening for the things that are most important. And where they're going to be on the phones, they're going to be communicating, they're going to be dealing with spontaneous speech. You want to make sure that the assessment can actually measure how well they're able to succeed in that context, and not just a general knowledge or understanding of the language in kind of a book smart way.
Yeah, and I think that beyond just kind of the broad sense of why language testing is important, I'm curious where it maybe goes wrong. I know that you and I have spoken, you've shared some information about why traditional language testing hasn't been so effective. So yeah, I think you just did a great job explaining why we need to test, but why after all these years has the conventional approach not been so effective?
Yeah, so that's what I mentioned before. Either what we've seen, we've worked with lots of clients in this area, is either they're not testing the right things. So they might have found a scalable, consistent, reliable way to test, as I mentioned, grammar or vocabulary, but those skills don't necessarily carry over to the skills they care about, which is, can this person speak and can this person understand what's being said? So that's one piece, is there's misalignment in what's being tested or what's being considered as language. The second piece, so those, a lot of our clients we're working with have recognized, yeah, we need to test their speaking ability. There's not very many ways to do that other than having someone who speaks the language converse and try to ascertain in the recruiting process if the person coming in understands them at a suitable level to do their job. But the inherent problem with having a person in charge of that, there's a few problems, right? So first of all, if that person who's conducting those language evaluations isn't trained, it's easy for them to be fooled. So something you'll see if you look into a lot of the language assessment research is that someone's inherent charisma can sometimes make the listener think that they can communicate better than they actually can. So if you have a language rater who isn't trained to look for the specific nuances that are going to matter most, they might not be actually measuring the right things that you want them to measure as well. And let's say you do have someone who's trained, not only is there obvious cost in this person having to take time with each individual applicant that comes in, that doesn't scale very easily, but a lot of our clients have multiple locations. And so if they have multiple locations, they often have multiple people who are in charge of the language evaluation process. And if it's hard enough to get one person consistent and reliable in terms of how they're rating, imagine doing that across multiple locations with multiple people. You're going to have different locations that frankly are better than others because it all relies on how well that language evaluator is screening those through the process. And so once, especially as things grow and as you're talking about more and more candidates coming in, it gets really untenable if you're using humans as the way to assess speaking. And so I think there's several problems, and there's lots of opportunities for us to overcome those problems as well using AI.
Yeah, and another point you brought up is the notion that, sometimes just the virtue of the time that it takes for manual testing, you have in a job where a lot of times people are interviewing with 15 different potential call center gigs in a single day, maybe not so much right now, and we'll get into the work environment situation in a second, but in the historical context in a world where people might be walking from call center to call center trying to find a job, they're expecting a yes or no answer kind of based on that interview. And if you have to wait an extended period of time for the test results, you can't give them that answer, and the call center across the street might be the one that ends up hiring them, and you lose out on some great talent.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So one of the ways that we've had clients tell us that they've tried to make it more scalable is by using an asynchronous type of approach, where instead of, like you said, in person, They would meet with them and measure them and right there on the spot give them a score. They would collect either a video or audio recording or something, and then after the fact, they would go through and rate it, or they would use services that do the same thing. But just like you mentioned, if it takes even 24 hours to get those results back, which 24 hours in that type of scenario is actually pretty fast. That's a pretty quick turnaround for asynchronous evaluation. But even 24 hours, if the person's gone across the street and got another job, you've missed out, and you've just spent all that time and money now on someone who is no longer a candidate. So it's really not the most efficient process.
Now, when you kind of alluded to this with the fact that, as we have a distributed workforce, it adds more potential error and inconsistency in this process. And that's what many of us are looking at right now. When we're looking at many contact centers working from home, at least partially, if not entirely right now, I'd imagine it's adding even more complexity and challenge to this process, because the fact is customer demands are not decreasing. If anything, we're seeing a lot of companies referencing that they have to hire more customer support workers, because now you have this whole new channel of all these online customer support questions that you suddenly have to have staff ready to answer. And so it's not as if just because the business world has changed, we're shrinking our headcounts. These headcounts might be rising, which means we have to recruit, and yet we don't have as much in-person interfacing with these people. So how perhaps is the work from home atmosphere contributing to some of these inefficiencies you talked about?
It's huge. I mean, I mentioned before, those who have decided to use speaking evaluations as a primary way to measure their language ability, those frankly aren't options for a lot of people who have to hire remotely now. Unless you try to use Zoom and setting up a Zoom meeting kind of like we're doing here, that gets really labor intensive and time intensive, and it's prone for all sorts of failures. And so I think the work from home, just changing environments that we see ourselves in now make it all the more important to say, if there's a solution, that can be self-service, it can be delivered remotely, and it can be autonomous in the sense that it can be delivered and the score can be given without any other person or factor needed to make that successful, then it really can accommodate what we're seeing in the world now, which is a digital transformation. It's a big deal. So I think this has only shown that, yes, we do need to use more AI solutions to enhance, or what's the better word, I'm blanking on the word, to help us do what we're already doing, but do it better.
I think augment's another word people use for that kind of thing as well, just as cliche though. But the reality is, so you brought up some of the key challenges, and where there's clearly a gap where theoretically an automated solution would play a big role here. So I want to give you the chance to walk through though the vision of, as you're constructing an automated language screening test, a process here that will eliminate some of the gaps that we were talking about. What were kind of the key components? What ultimately was that vision for this solution that you were confident was going to address the lingering problems you mentioned, as well as perhaps some of the newer challenges we've seen as a result of remote work?
Yeah, so I'm going to dip in just for some background. I got my PhD in instructional technology, focusing on language acquisition. So there was a lot of research that went into the approach that we have now. So I'm going to dip in a little bit into the science that might be interesting to you. So whenever you're measuring something that's in a psychological realm, and language certainly fits there, we often call it a latent trait. So latent means it's unobservable. Like, I can't cut your head open and measure and see how well you understand or know the language. The only way that we can ever measure language is by what we can observe. And usually what we observe is at least one step removed in the cognitive process of what's actually happening in the brain. So language assessment in general is inherently hard because of that one step removal of what we're measuring. All psychological assessment is that way. And so what we do is, there's a whole field called psychometrics, which is specifically developing a set of statistics and algorithms that can take the data that we can observe and then run it through a predictive series using AI to then start to pinpoint what is that latent trait, what is the actual process of language happening, and how can we use all the data that we're observing in order to get to that point. So that's the main objective of what we sought to do, is say, okay, how can we, one, elicit the right type of data in a test administration process? So we know for example, in the contact center industry, if the assessment administration process is longer than 10 or 15 minutes, it's untenable. And so sometimes if you have to use, for example, a spontaneous speech or open response, sometimes those can take 30, 45 minutes to get the right number of data that you need. So what we've done, and this a lot came from my dissertation research, is there are ways that you can use the combination of cognitive science, including your short-term memory, your ability to hold information in your brain, and language ability in terms of measuring how well someone can, we use the term chunking a lot. So chunking means how well can someone be more efficient when they're speaking. So when you and I are speaking right now to each other, our brains, what we're not doing is we're not saying, okay, here are all the individual sounds that we need. Let's put those sounds together into words. Let's put those words together into phrases. We are so familiar and comfortable with the English language that our brain can skip all those steps, and we speak in phrases. We don't speak in sounds or words. But as you know, when you're learning a language, you have to start there. You have to start with the sounds. You then build into words. You then build into phrases. And so what our test uniquely does is it combines what we know about someone's kind of what that progress and development process looks like when someone's learning a language, combined with their cognitive ability, with their short-term memory, and in a pretty unique way for us to then give a really strong prediction of their language ability. So I didn't get into too many of the nuts and bolts and weeds, and you might have more questions about that. But using, again, psychometrics and speech recognition with AI to as the base of our evaluation of the data coming in, and then being able to measure those trends and plot it against traditional methods, which are interview-based methods, we've been able to find really good agreement with, again, our 10 to 15 minute automatically scored assessment. And that's what, if it can't be that short, 10 to 15 minutes, and if it can't give you scores immediately, then we're going to keep running into the same problems that we've identified at the beginning of the call.
Now, that said, I mean, you hit on, when people talk about different automation solutions, one of the big discussion points is there's a degree of compromise, right? You're going to hit those efficiencies, you're going to be able to scale what you're doing, but perhaps you're going to lose some of the valuable human element that's involved here. Now, I think you actually did a great job explaining why the human approach may be ineffective when it comes to language testing, but I also want to challenge you and ask you if there are any risks of compromise when you start to automate something that fundamentally is about human connection.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's a really good question. The answer to that is the scale to which the results you need, or let me rephrase it. How important of a decision are you making based on the evaluation that you're getting? So oftentimes when people ask me that, I flat out say, our current solution and approach using AI probably isn't the best solution if you're talking about college entrance, for example. College entrance is a very high stakes scenario. And if you were just to use an AI solution without some of the human element, then I'm thinking you might, be underserving some of your population. In these situations where we really need to know, do they speak well enough? It's kind of is it up to this point at least? And you're not necessarily interested in knowing, can this person, converse in an academic setting? Or, can this person, like a flight attendant, for example, right? Or a pilot, is this person's going to have, their communication skills, is it going to directly relate to, the potential hundreds of lives that are in that airplane, right? If they miscommunicate something back and forth, you're thinking like air traffic control or something like that. So I think that needs to be taken into account. So definitely for these purposes, for screening and recruiting, when you want to make sure they're at least enough, I think it's fully appropriate to use an AI solution that gives you enough confidence that they can do the job, but it doesn't need to go to the level of nuance that some of the other evaluation settings need.
Now, and then alternatively, there's also an upside that a lot of people bring up with AI technology beyond the scalability, and that's the lack of bias. So, when you think of whether you're looking at customer data, or in this case, whether you're evaluating potential employees, a lot of times there's a human bias factor. Like you started off by saying, if I'm really charismatic and we have a great conversation, I may not actually be saying the right words or nailing the language, but because we have such a good rapport, there's an opportunity for you to think I'm a great potential employee. And then when I have to answer some basic questions, I'm not ready for it. So, but that said, maybe there might be some biases with an AI approach as well. So I'm wondering if you can kind of walk through the objectivity of this approach to screening and whether that's an advantage or not.
Yeah, I'll mention two things. So there certainly is the risk for bias in an AI solution, and I'll talk about that and what we do to overcome that. But what you mentioned in terms of being biased by irrelevant factors, such as, like you said, charisma, unfortunately, there's still bias due to age, to race, to sex, to attractiveness. These all, when you're dealing with people, even if they're not consciously doing it, they can subconsciously affect your decisions, where those are all irrelevant to what needs to and is being measured. And so it's very, and also there's, depending on who you have doing the evaluations, they might even have particular bias towards certain levels of English. If they've learned in this area versus this area, if they prefer this accent, one accent might be totally understandable and acceptable, but because this person prefers an English accent or something like that, they might negatively impact their score. So there's a lot of elements for human bias that are really, really hard to control. And as you mentioned, using a computerized solution, one thing you do know is it will evaluate every single person on the same set of criteria. It doesn't deviate from those set of criteria no matter what. So you know that the objectivity is there. One thing you have to be careful about with an AI solution is your training data. So if you're feeding it training data that carries bias, then the AI solution itself will have bias as well. So for example, if we were, as a company, calibrating all of our assessments and items that are in our assessments with, let's say, middle-aged, middle-class college students in the United States, there would certainly be bias that would bleed into the algorithm because our training data is not diverse enough. So that's something that we've been very cognizant of and made sure that as we initially calibrated all of our items, that we made sure to have the appropriate diversity in our training data. But also, we have a living and breathing AI system that as we take in data now from all different parts of the world, it's all feeding into mitigating and eliminating the bias that might come from any particular one area or one class of life. So there certainly is potential for bias. It's a different type of bias, but if you make sure that you're controlling for your training data, it's very overcomable.
Yeah, now another thing you brought up is that, yes, ultimately a lot of people were hiring for a call center job. They may not be dealing with life and death situations. They may not be dealing with kind of, supremely academic linguistic challenges where you need to have a complete mastery of a language. That said, they are the face of our brand, right? They are what they say and how they communicate with a customer can greatly impact our relationship with that customer, whether that customer buys more or not down the road. And so they're obviously relying on these tests, we need to know that the people we're getting in these seats are going to be good ambassadors for our brand. So what would you say to confirm why the scoring that you're able to generate and why what you're able to find from these tests is valid, is accurate, and ultimately does allow us to be confident that the people that we're going to hire as a result of these tests are going to be great for our brand?
Yeah, that's a good point. A few things come to mind. A lot of times when we talk about language proficiency, so proficiency means, can you use the skill in its authentic setting? So if you're a proficient speaker, that means when you're speaking, you can speak well. And this kind of goes back to my original point of you don't use a multiple choice grammar test to see if someone's a good speaker. Language is typically viewed as an inverse triangle. So if you imagine if I had a triangle here and the volume or the area in that triangle going from bottom to the top, the amount of work it takes to, so if you took kind of laterally and considered these different language levels. So if we use CFR for an example, at the very bottom is A1 and then A2, A3. And if it had equal distance, horizontally as you go up, the amount of effort it takes and the area it takes as you're going up this triangle increases each time. So what I mean to say that is going from A1 to A2 takes less effort than going from A2 to B1, which takes less effort than going from B1 to B2. Does that make sense? So at each stage, it does take more time, more hours, and conversely, your ability to do with the language also dramatically increases. And we find once you reach the B2, C1 area, you can converse on basically any topic. You might not be able to go deep in a lot of other topics, but you can converse on basically any topic. And so what we found is clients, that's what they really want to see is, based on their general proficiency ability, if they can get at least to these levels, and this is what our test provides, it says this is where they're at in their general proficiency. So we probe them on all sorts of different unexpected areas to then say, okay, across the board, where does this person end up? And then something else that's really interesting that we sometimes forget about in terms of language is, I don't remember the exact statistics, but somewhere in the 80% range, 80% of all the language that we use day to day uses 2,000 words or fewer. So the 2,000 most common words can handle about 80% of all of your interactions. And you bump that up to 3,000 words and you're already in the 90%. So for a lot of the language that these will be dealing with from a proficiency standpoint, if you can at least ensure that someone's in that area where they can speak across the board, if they have any sort of specialized needs, and which will come off, obviously, if you have a specific product or a specific thing you're working on, there might be some specific words or vocabulary that they need to work on in order to support that product. They can spike in those areas as long as they have the general proficiency they need across the board. And so what we provide, we don't provide necessarily what those specific spikes will be. Our customers are all different and they all have different needs. And so after someone's hired and they know that they're at least at this proficiency level, they know that they can get them to perform in these other areas, at least as long as they have that general proficiency level that we provide.
Now, with any sort of technology purchase or really any customer contact initiative that a company's going to undertake, there's that question of why. Now, you gave a great example of why for people who understand the recruiting process, who understand why language is important, where companies run into challenges as they're going through this. But the why for the person who's signing the check and signing off on the budget may be different. They may want to know, is this going to be more efficient? Am I going to save money as a result of this technology? Now, as you said, different companies are going to use your solution in a different way. You're going to see different results and different goals. That said, I'm sure you have a sense of maybe where some of the efficiencies might be, where the cost savings might be, and ultimately what kind of ROI someone would be looking at if they decided to use your solution.
Yeah, 100%. We go through this with clients all the time. And we have plenty of testimonials where we've been able to curb some of the churn and increase retention. Because retention, that's probably one of the biggest value propositions that having a robust language evaluation in the recruiting and screening process provides. Because it's two sides of the same coin. One, if they're not performing, two things are going to happen. Either thing number one, you're going to notice from an administrative standpoint, you're going to notice they're not hitting their numbers, they're not communicating well enough, their reviews aren't very well, they're not representing the brand well, they're not doing their job. And after some time, however long it takes you to find that out, sometimes that can be up to a month, you're going to let this person go. And when you let this person go, there's a cost of all of the training and the screening that you invested into this person now that you have to leave and you have to allocate to someone else. But on the flip side, even if you don't let this person go, we've found that if someone themselves isn't confident and they know that they're not performing well, they often self-select out. So that someone who's not feeling like they're contributing positively, that they're doing a good job, even if they're not let go, they tend to churn out faster than others who feel like this is kind of in their wheelhouse. And so I think if you look at the cost of both that churn or having to let someone go, it gets pretty easy to see the value add of a few dollar assessment in the beginning to make sure that they meet these criteria could save hundreds or thousands of dollars of the time and training that eventually could be wasted if this person isn't a good candidate.
And that's another area where the work from home environment probably compounds the importance of that, because right now, the last thing you want to reduce churn the best you can, because as hard as recruiting, onboarding, and training was when you had a physical contact center and you can meet these people in person, it's dramatically harder, in a remote environment. I know we're trying to look into real-time learning and some automated knowledge bases and stuff, but just the confidence of getting people up to speed if they're not familiar at all with your company now is going to be a lot higher. And so if you can keep people for longer and get them more familiar, that's going to really pay dividends for your experience. So I very much like that approach, that you're not even just looking at the, oh, you're going to save money on tests kind of thing, but instead you're going to save money over the long term because you're going to have people that are a good fit for your organization, that are ready for the work they're going to be taking on, and therefore you're going to be able to keep that knowledge within your company, save on future recruiting, and help make sure that every interaction you have comes from a knowledgeable agent who's best suited to represent your customers and best suited to connect with them.
Yeah, and so what's interesting too in terms of value proposition of doing language assessment is sometimes it's a double-edged sword, and we have complete empathy because we know for a lot of contact centers, the number one most important thing is, hey, we have this contract, we need to get, this is kind of a crude term, right? But we need to get this many butts in seats. We need to fill these places. And so adding more criteria up front could actually be, work in opposition to our main goal, which is we need people in on the phones. And so we try to find that delicate balance of saying the purpose of this isn't necessarily to kick people out. It's to give you information about where they're at as quickly as possible. You still may choose, if you're in a crunch, to lower your standards, based on any sort of business decision you need. But at least then you know where they stand, and you can stack that across, the other people that you have coming in. What we mentioned before too is, especially if your main goal is to fulfill or get enough people into your door to fulfill a contract quickly. If you're losing qualified applicants because you can't hire them fast enough, because you can't get information about, their ability fast enough, if the turnaround isn't immediate, that's a huge, huge cost. And so having a solution, like I said, where you can have them take a test, get the results immediately and move forward, and even potentially hire them right when they come in, it reduces the risk of you missing out on good quality candidates when you need to fill those seats.
So to put it simply, you're going to have a better sense of who you're hiring, you have a better chance of getting the right people, and you're going to be able to do it quicker, even in a remote environment. So certainly sounds like a lot of great advantages to have for a solution. And I want to thank you, Jacob, for taking the time to share what you're working on, why it's so important. Any final thoughts you have for our audience as we wrap up here?
No, I'm pleased to be able to share some of our experiences here. We are always working on providing a stronger and better value proposition. One of the things that we're working on that we'll be bringing out in the end of this year and the beginning of next year is more specific granular data in terms of not just is this person across the board, B1, C2, whatever on the C4 scale, but also specifically if this person is close, but they're just maybe not as good in their pronunciation, or maybe they're not as good in their vocabulary knowledge. That could, for example, if someone's in a situation where they need to hire someone, they might say, well, this person, if they had a little bit more remedial training in this one particular area, would actually be up to speed. And that, just like I said, if we can provide as much data as possible to then let our clients make a decision, we feel like we're doing our job. And so we're always trying to improve that data and make it more granular.
Awesome. Sounds like, again, the right vision. You're solving a legitimate problem out there, and one that, while, maybe isn't the conventional talking point for everyone in customer contact, is one that just about every contact center is going through, when they're going to continue to go through. And so it's great to see someone using AI to identify a real problem and come up with a real solution. So thanks so much to Jacob as well as Immersion for sharing their details on the True North approach. And for CCW Online, I can't wait for the event to continue as we have more great insights from more great speakers.